I'm going to deal with an issue that I consider to be important, even though it's not directly related to prophecy, but in a way it is. But I'm just going to depart this evening. Now, let me give you a little background to what this is and why I want to look at it. One of the things that I have mentioned before that is of some concern to me is the fact that many people who become disillusioned with their former church or their former fellowship will sometimes do something that I consider a little bit foolish, which is that they will just give up everything that they ever believed in association with that church or that fellowship, and they will just condemn everything, and they will attach themselves to something else or to another group and just embrace everything that that group embraces. And I find this to be a harmful approach, very, I consider it dangerous. And as all of you know, my background is that I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, and I actually was disfellowshipped in 1985, a long time ago. It wasn't because I was committing any moral sin, as they would refer to it, but they said I was disfellowshipped because of a failure to heed properly constituted church authority. I'm glad I was disfellowshipped for that. It means that I would not bow to the dictates of the system, and so they disfellowshipped me. But even though I was disfellowshipped, I never condemned the teaching of Adventism. It was afterwards that I began to understand the truth about the one God, and I began to break away from the shackles of the doctrinal teachings. Those had kept me bound for a while. I know that Sister Destiny can empathize with what I'm saying because she came from a Jehovah's Witness background, and you know how hard it is to break when you have been involved in something for a long time. But once your mind is free, once you come to recognize that they can be wrong, all of a sudden the floodgates open and you're seeing things you never saw before. And I think that happened to most of us, many of us here who have been a part of a denominational system. Most of us probably were a part of the Adventist church. Now, here's the thing that I consider to be a dangerous thing. Many people that I know, many of my friends or acquaintances who have come to the same place, what they did was they just condemned everything that used to be a part of that system. Like many people who used to be Jehovah's Witnesses, they become evangelicals and they embrace the Trinity. I know Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in the Trinity, but their version of it is a little different than how we understand it. They believe Jesus was a created being, which we know there's a difference between being created and being born. They believe Jesus was a creature. We believe he was divinity. Anyway, there's that difference. But anyway, the fact that they were wrong on so many things, they don't believe in the new birth as we understand it, all of that, but it doesn't mean that everything they thought was wrong. What we need to do is to take each thing and take it to the Lord, and now with an open mind and a careful approach, we bring everything to the test of the scripture as we wait on the Spirit to teach us. And that is what I have found to be the best approach. I found this to be God's way. God does not give us truth in blocks. Like if you join this church or if you belong to this group, you have all the truth that you will ever need. No. Even the Apostle Paul in the days of the wonderful apostolic church, he said, study to show yourself approved. A watchman that does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So we are encouraged to study. Now, I'm going to look at one particular thing this evening, which is I'm going to look at the sanctuary in Hebrews chapter 9. Why Hebrews chapter 9? It is popularly believed by evangelical Christians, and it has been accepted by many people who have become disillusioned with Adventism and stepped away from Adventism, that when Jesus went back to heaven, they believe that the book of Hebrews teaches that when Jesus went back to heaven, he went directly into the most holy place of the sanctuary. Now, you know that Adventists believe that when Jesus went back to heaven, he went into the holy place, and that it was not until 1844 he went into the most holy place. What they believe is that Jesus was in one apartment of the sanctuary for about 1800 years, and then after 1800 years, he went into the next apartment. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to look at what I believe to be the correct interpretation. But what the evangelicals do, and what those Adventists who have broken away, what they do, they just embrace the evangelical view, which says Jesus went to heaven and he went directly to the most holy place. Maybe this is true, maybe it is not true. But does Hebrews chapter 9 teach this? That's what I want to look at. Do we find in the book, what do we find in Hebrews chapter 9? Now, what I'm going to do is, it can be a little complicated. I will try my best to break it down as simply as possible, okay? But it has to do with looking at, a little bit of different translations and the original language. So it can get complicated. So I'm going to ask you this. If I fail in my efforts to break it down, if I fail, please just put up your hand. Please just unmute your mic and let me know. I don't want to leave you behind with an irrelevant study. I want you to understand why this is important, why we conclude, why we come to the conclusions that we come to. And I want you to see where it makes sense. All right. So first of all, I'm going to go to the Bible, and I'm going to read the passage in question. And I want to say again, I want to repeat that if you find it challenging to follow what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to point out, I'm going to ask you to just, by all means, this afternoon, you have all encouragement to stop me and to tell me to go back over that, or this part I can't understand, or this part doesn't make sense. All right, please. So I'm going to go to Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. Now, the book of Hebrews, as you know, is written to Hebrew Christians. That is, it was written to Israelites, to Jews, fleshly Jews, Israelites. And the main point of the book of Hebrews is that the Apostle Paul is trying to help these people to understand that the law was good, but something greater and better has been put in place. And what he focuses on, he compares in every part of the book of Hebrews. He is comparing the old covenant law and the old covenant system to Christ and the new covenant system. And if you even look at Hebrews chapter 1, he kind of gives us a synopsis. And he says in verse 1, chapter 8, now of the things which we have spoken, this is the summary or the totality. Here is a summary of what I've been saying. That's what he's saying, okay? We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. And he says he's a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. So in this particular part of the book of Hebrews, he's going to look at the question of the ministry of Christ in the sanctuary. Now, he talked about how Christ's priesthood is superior, is better than the Levitical priesthood. He talks about how Christ's covenant is a better covenant. If you look at verse 6, it says, but now hath he obtained a what? A more excellent ministry. He has a better ministry than the Old Testament ministry. By how much he's a mediator of what? A better covenant, better ministry, better covenant. In some places, he said it's a more excellent ministry. It's established upon better promises. So in every way, what Paul is saying is that the new is better, is greater, is more effective than the old. Now, with this in mind, he says that Christ is a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. He refers to it as a true tabernacle. which the Lord pitched and not man. Based on this, would you say that there is a sanctuary or a temple in this new covenant? Would you say that there is something where Christ, there's a place where Christ ministers, which is called the sanctuary, and which is also referred to as the true tabernacle? I've heard all kinds of explanations of this. There are some people who say there's no sanctuary in heaven. They say that the true sanctuary refers to the Christian church and to the bodies of Christians. My body is a temple of God. Paul teaches this. The Christian church is a temple of God. Paul teaches this also. So the question is there a place in heaven which is called the sanctuary? Well, if you look at this, it says that he's a minister of the sanctuary. He's a minister of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, or God set it up, and not man. I think based on this, we would have good reason to say that there is a sanctuary in heaven. Now, of course, we know sometimes the Bible speaks in a figurative sense, but I still think if you say, I believe there's a sanctuary in heaven, you're on safer ground than somebody who says there's no sanctuary, because the Bible says it very clearly here. And if you go, I know that Revelation is a very symbolic book, very figurative, but if you go to Revelation, you still find places where Revelation is trying to point you to the idea that there is, if there's not a sanctuary, there's a sanctuary equivalent in heaven. If you look at Revelation 11 and verse 19, it says, and the temple of God was opened in heaven. This is not talking about the Christian church, and it's not talking about you, the Christian believer. It seems that at the very least, God wants us to believe that there's something in heaven representing what we call the sanctuary here on earth. There's something in heaven that represents it. So, of course, what does it look like? We may not be able to answer this question, or we might. We'll see as we proceed. We may not be able to answer it, but at any rate, we know that God wants us to take note that there's something equivalent to what was present on earth. Now, when I say equivalent, what do I mean? Equivalent means it's not exactly the same, but it represents it. You know, like Jesus is the equivalent of the lamb that they killed. He's not like a lamb. He doesn't have 4 feet. He doesn't have horns. He doesn't have wool. He doesn't walk around on fours. But he's the equivalent of the lamb, because the lamb represented something, and that something is Jesus. So he's equivalent, but he's not the same. You see what I mean? So I mean that in heaven, you know that there's an equivalent of the sanctuary. It represented something, but it may not be. I mean, the sanctuary on earth was built out of stones, and it was plated with gold. A lot of it was covered with gold. In the wilderness, when Moses built it, it was covered over with animal skins, and it was made of board and all of that. There absolutely is not something like this in heaven, but there's something there that represents the work that was being done in the sanctuary on earth, and that is what I want us to understand. The Bible says he's a minister of this sanctuary. There's something that Jesus does that is the equivalent of this work that was happening on earth. Now, I would like to go to a few illustrations here to make my point. In Hebrews 9 and verse 1, maybe I should read it in the Bible, and then I should look at my my illustrations. Let's read the first 3 verses. We're going to spend some time. As a matter of fact, let me read from verse 1 to about verse 11. It says, then verily or truly the first covenant, that is the one that Moses was given, it had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. You have to think about what you're reading. It says it had also. What does the word also mean? It means, I think it means, just like the one we are talking about. We are talking about the second covenant. The second covenant has ordinances of divine service. I wouldn't call them ordinances. It has some divine service. The first one had also these ordinances, some ordinances relating to divine service, and it had a worldly sanctuary. Why does it say that there was a worldly sanctuary? Why does it emphasize the word worldly? Because at this moment, we are going to be discussing the heavenly sanctuary. So Paul emphasizes that the one that we are talking about that used to exist was a worldly one. Like I said, it's not the same. It's not even similar, but it may not even be similar, but it's equivalent. All right, I hope we understood that the use of that word. Then he goes on to explain. For there was a tabernacle made, that's the one on earth here, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. And over it the cherubims of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. All right, so I think I should read to verse 9, and then I'll stop and we'll go to my illustrations. Now I will read carefully, but you're not going to see my point until I point out what I'm trying to say. But I'll read it anyway. Now, when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. But into the second went the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. Now here's the verse that they say, here's the verse that is maybe a key verse. Verses 11 and 12. But Christ being come an high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Look at this verse now. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. This is the verse that they say overthrows everything that Adventists teach. This verse says that Jesus entered in once into the holy place, and they interpret this to mean the most holy place. As a matter of fact, let me see what it says in the NIV. Yeah, the NIV, look at the NIV on the right part of the screen. He entered the most holy place once for all. The NIV says it's the most holy place. Let me see what the World English Bible says. It says the holy place, all right? The New English Translation. New English Translation says the most holy place. Let me see what the Amplified Bible says. The Amplified Bible says the Holy of Holies of heaven. The English Standard Version says, okay, holy places. All right, you know what I wanted to show you is that most of the modern translations say, they agree that when Jesus went to heaven, he entered into the most holy place, otherwise referred to as the Holy of Holies. So based on this, most people say that the Adventist idea is a fallacy. Jesus went straight to the most holy place. So why is this important? I'll tell you why. Because, you know, we have been looking at something that I've been trying to emphasize. And what I've been trying to say is that we are living in a time when we will experience the Day of Atonement. Okay? If you have been following our studies in the book of Revelation, what we saw is that the book of Revelation is focused on something extraordinary to happen to God's people in the last moments of time. what was represented as the Day of Atonement in the Old Covenant system, the second to last of the feast days, it is to be fulfilled in this end of time. Now, this is important because this Day of Atonement is the last event that takes place in the sanctuary. It involved the sprinkling of the blood in the most holy place. It was sprinkled there 7 times. So it involves something to happen represented by the most holy place of the sanctuary. But if Jesus if Jesus accomplished this 2,000 years ago, then what I have been saying, what we have been studying is foolishness. What they say is that Jesus performed the Day of Atonement 2,000 years ago. There's no end time Day of Atonement, they say. And they say you can tell because Jesus went into the most holy place. Remember, the priest only went into the most holy place once in the year. And whatever happened in the year, in the Hebrew year, it represented the events of salvation. So by the time you come to the end of that year, everything is over. God put everything on a timeline of 1 year. So the events of that year represents the events of salvation from beginning to end. And by the time you come to the Feast of Tabernacles, it is over. Nothing else is to follow. So if Jesus went into the most holy place, if Jesus accomplished the Day of Atonement when he died at Calvary 2,000 years ago, and he went into the most holy place in heaven 2,000 years ago, then we already have experienced the Day of Atonement. What we have been studying together about the Day of Atonement is nonsense. And this is the conclusion many people come to. They abandon Seventh-day Adventism. They say Adventism is a bunch of idle tales, and they abandon the idea of an end-time Day of Atonement. They reject the idea that there is any ministry in the sanctuary represented by the Day of Atonement in our time. And they just jump into the teaching of the evangelical Christians and they embrace it and reject everything that has to do with what they once believed. I always emphasize this, okay? I am not defending anything because I was an Adventist. Everything that I ever believed, whether it's a Sabbath, whether it's the end time Day of Atonement, whether it's some of the teachings of the book of Revelation, you know how many things I have changed concerning Adventism. You know, they are Trinitarians. I am not a Trinitarian. You know, they are legalistic. I have escaped that by God's grace. You know that I don't understand I don't hold to their understanding of the investigative judgment. I'm not following the teachings of a denomination, but still, my goodness, why should I throw out the baby with the bath water? If I find something that is biblical and it makes sense and it's clearly biblical, why would I throw it away just because many of the things that I once learned were wrong? Why would I do this? I'm not interested in denominations. I'm interested in what is true. And I think this is what God wants us to be concerned about. We are concerned about truth. And I believe that Adventism is messed up in many ways, but I believe that they had some truth. And the end time Day of Atonement is one of those things. So this is why I am highlighting what I'm highlighting this evening, because I know you will encounter people like ourselves who will tell you that the end time Day of Atonement is nonsense. And they will tell you that when Jesus went back to heaven, the book of Hebrews teaches that he went straight into the most holy place. And they will use this passage. But we're going to look at this now, and I'm going to try to show you that the book of Hebrews does not teach this. This passage does not teach that Jesus went into the most holy place as the NIV and the Amplified Version and some of these other versions give us. I'm going to show you it does not. This is one of those places in the Bible where it reminds us of how careful we need to be when we are using different Bible translations, because a lot of time the Bible writers, I'm not going to say they are dishonest, I say based on how they understand what they're reading, they need to make it make sense. And so sometimes they add words or change words that to them make sense. But when you approach it and look at it and you examine the original language, it does not say what they have it saying at all. You know, if it said the correct thing, you wouldn't have two different translations giving you two different meanings. There is one version of the Bible that correctly translates Hebrews 9 based on the Greek text. Okay, one version gives you, it does not mess with it at all. It just translates what is there. I don't know if it's this way for all the Bible, but I know in Hebrews 9, this version of the Bible is the one I usually have up on the screen. It's a New American Standard Bible. Okay, the New American Standard Bible has strictly stayed with what the original writing says. And it's interesting when you look at it. I'm going to come to that. But let me go now to my illustrations. I hope that I've not left anybody behind so far. I hope you understand what I'm saying and why I think it's important that we understand this. So, Hebrews 9 and verse 1. The first covenant, and when he says the first covenant, of course, he's referring to the covenant that was established by Moses, the first covenant that was established in the time of Moses. It had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. So this is what basically, this is what Paul is saying. This was established in the time of Moses. And he says, now, of the things we have spoken, we looked at this verse already also. Here's a summary of what we have spoken about. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. And he says of this high priest, he is a minister of what? A minister of the sanctuary. So Jesus has a ministry, and it's a ministry in a sanctuary. And he refers to it as a true tabernacle. Not that the other one was false, but the other one was simply a model. It was simply an illustration. This true tabernacle is the one that God set up. The Lord pitched it. The other one was set up by Moses, and later on, it was rebuilt out of permanent material by Solomon, and later on by Herod and the Romans, the people who came back from Babylon. They built it, and Herod embellished it. Anyway, we're talking about the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. So, as I pointed out, when you go to the book of Revelation, you find that it speaks of a sanctuary. As a matter of fact, when you go to the very first chapter of Revelation, what we see is Jesus walking in the midst of 7 candlesticks. When you see candlesticks, 7 candlesticks, what comes to your mind immediately? If you are familiar with the Bible, you know that there was a candlestick with 7 branches that was set up in the earthly sanctuary. So right from the first chapter of Revelation, you can say God is pointing our attention to the fact that Jesus is ministering in the sanctuary. Okay, absolutely. All of us know it's nothing like what happened on earth. You know, the priest would bring his blood and he would burn incense and all the rest of it. Absolutely, that is nothing like what is happening. All of these representations were what should I call them? Were clues to give us a hint, or a hint of something much greater. I don't know how I can illustrate that, other than to just point to a couple of things that we are certain about. One of the things is, okay, the priest would take the blood of an animal into the temple and he would sprinkle the blood. Now I say that this was to give us a hint of something greater. Now think of the real thing. Now Jesus is a minister in the heavenly sanctuary. Okay, does he have blood sprinkling? Does he have a bowl with blood? You know that is absolute stupidity to believe this, even though there's somebody who told me they actually believe this. Okay, that's the fruit of mindless legalistic thinking. There is no literal blood that is being sprinkled in heaven. You know this. So what is happening? What does you know that the blood represents what? It represents life. So does Jesus have a bowl with his life offering before God. You know that this is nonsensical thinking. But it is the life of Christ that stands in our place in the presence of God. So does Jesus take out his life and hold it up before God? Nonsense. But God, the thing that forever makes us acceptable to God, that forever makes us fully eligible to be God's children and to stand in his presence, is the life of Jesus Christ forever. He doesn't have to take his life in a bowl. He doesn't have to go before his Father and say, my life. No, it's a permanent, fixed reality for all eternity. The blood of Jesus Christ, the life of Jesus Christ is my entitlement. And he doesn't have to have a bowl sprinkling something. Yet in the illustration, he had a bowl sprinkling blood. So what I mean is, I'm trying to show you that the illustration gave us a hint. It gave us a clue. But look at how different the clue and the hint is from the real thing. Look at how different. It's so different that if you see Jesus today ministering, you don't even think of blood and you don't even think of a bowl. It has nothing to do with bowls and blood. So if you think that Jesus is in heaven doing something similar to what the priest did on earth, I'm sorry. You're childish and simplistic in your thinking. It's so much greater that I and none of us can understand properly what is involved. But we just know that, it is explained. We can explain it by using the illustration. Like the apostle will say, the blood of Jesus Christ cleanseth us from all sin. That's what John says. Okay, and if you are simplistic, you will say, John says blood cleanses us from sin. It is blood that cleanses. But you see, he's using the language from the symbol, because John himself can't explain to you how the life of Christ literally cleanses you of sin. He can't explain it. We're talking about spiritual things. We know it happens, but can you explain to anybody how it happens? But you can use the illustration and you can use the terminology from the illustration. And so you can say, I understand what happens. Anyway, so I'm saying that Jesus is a minister of this sanctuary. But how that ministry takes place, we would be a little bit presumptuous to think that we understand exactly how it happens. So I want us to look at the layout of the sanctuary. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Now, this was basically the pattern or the outline or the ground plan of the sanctuary. If you would enter from the left would be the east, and you would enter from the east. I mean, if you were the priest, all right, you would enter from the left, and the first thing you would see is this square. The square here represents the altar where they would sacrifice the animals. As you proceeded, the next thing you would come upon is this round basin. It was called a laver, where the priest would wash after they ministered in the sanctuary and before they went into minister. Then you'd come to the sanctuary itself, which was this rectangular building. It had two apartments, as you can see, two rooms. There was a curtain here where you'd go through the curtain and you'd enter into the first apartment, the first section, which was called the holy place. And inside of that holy place, there was a candlestick with the 7 branches on the left that was on the southern side. And on the right, you had a table with 12 loaves of bread. They always had the bread, and they would change the bread every week. The bread was always to be there. And then just in front of the next room, right at the curtain, you had a little golden altar. This square here represents a golden altar where they would burn incense and where the fire was to be kept burning continually. All of this has very striking meaning for your experience and my experience. But like the Apostle Paul says in Hebrews chapter 9, we cannot now speak of these things in detail. I'm saying the same thing this evening. I'm making a different point. I'm not going into details about what all of this meant. Now, separating this room from the next room, there was a curtain. There was another curtain, and behind the curtain, there was just one item of furniture. It was called the Ark of the Covenant. It was a gold-plated box made of wood, but it was plated. It was covered over with gold, and inside of this box there was the Ten Commandments, and there were some other there were some other things in the side of this box, like Aaron's rod that budded. It was put there, like a pot of manna was put there also. And also the laws that were given to Moses were put in the side of the ark. But in the body of the ark itself, there was the Ten Commandments. Above this box, as long as the presence of God was with Israel, there was a bright shining light, a supernatural light that had no power source. It was put there by God. It was a symbol of the presence of God. The Jews call it the Shekinah light. There were two angels carved out of gold on the top of this box. And in between these two angels, there was this bright shining light. Now, this was the layout of the sanctuary on earth. So, as I said, there are two perspectives. Adventists say that Jesus went up to heaven and he ministered in the first apartment, which they refer to as the holy place. And they say he stayed there for 2,000 years, for 1,800 years. And then in 1844, they say in 1844, he went into the second apartment. Now, there's a method to the madness. They do have an explanation for why they come to this conclusion. I don't know if I should take the time and explain that. Probably I should, all right? But let's look at the other Christians say that Jesus went directly into the most holy place when he went back to heaven. He was not in one apartment for 1,800 years. He went straight into the holiest place. And, you know, there are things that they can point to that support their point. For example, the Bible says Jesus went into heaven and sat down on the right hand of God. So he went right into the presence of God. There's no question of that. But what Adventists say is that God has a throne that moves. And the throne was in the first apartment when Jesus went back to heaven. So he went and sat on the right hand of God in the first apartment. Then they say in 1844, God's throne moved into the most holy place. And Jesus moved with him into the most holy place. Now, as much as this sounds a little bit crazy, it sounds a little bit crazy. All right, I know if you just talk about it like that. But I'm going to show you that Adventists also have a point. It's not as crazy as it sounds. I'm going to show you. Let's go back to the Bible and I'll show you why it's not as crazy as it sounds. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm going to show you why it's not necessarily as crazy as it sounds. All right. If I'm getting complicated, remember, please stop me. Okay. I'm trying to give you a complicated Bible study in a very short time. Look at Daniel 7. Let me show you why it's not so crazy. Daniel 7. Look at what it says here. This is speaking about the judgment that we have been studying about, the pre-Advent judgment. Look at what it says. I beheld till the thrones were cast down. Hold on a minute. What does it say happened? It says that thrones were cast down. As a matter of fact, if you look at what it says in the New American Standard Bible, it says, I kept looking until thrones were set up. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. Who is the Ancient of Days? The Ancient of Days is God. Daniel is seeing something happening in heaven. Again, you might say this is symbolic, and it very well may be. But something is happening in heaven, and what he sees is that some thrones are set in place. And look what happens. God sits down. The Ancient of Days took his seat. So you ask the question, where was he before he sat down? Where was God before he sat down? He was not sitting there all the time. He comes and they put thrones in place and God takes a seat. So clearly in heaven, according to what we are seeing here in Daniel, God was somewhere else. And then he came and took his seat. If you say this is probably symbolic, I'm not going to argue with that. I think it has a lot of symbolism about it, but I want to say that you have to take it into consideration. All right. Let me go also to Revelation chapter 4 and show you where the same scene is described. John says in Revelation 4 and verse 2, he's talking about the beginning of this judgment that we have been studying about. He says, and immediately I was in the spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven. What does he mean by saying a throne was set? And one sat on the throne. Why does he mention that a throne was set? It seems that he's suggesting, just like Daniel did, that a throne was put in place. The NASB says a throne was standing in heaven. But notice he mentions the throne being set in heaven before he mentions somebody sitting on the throne. So again, it seems to carry the idea that God takes a seat. Now, at the very least, what I'm going to say is I'm not going to necessarily support the idea that Jesus went to heaven and stayed in one apartment for 1800 years. I'm not going to support that. I'm not going to support that, but I'm going to support the idea that the Bible does give us a representation as though God moves to a different place when the judgment begins. I hope you can agree with me. If you look at Daniel chapter 7, it tells you a throne was set in place and somebody sat on the throne. So based on the Bible, if you say God moved to a different area when the judgment began, I would have to agree with you because that's what I see in the Bible. You might say it is symbolic, but God represents it that way, so nobody can tell you it is not so. All right. Now I wanted to
Question.
make that. Yes, brother Tony.
Okay, in Daniel 7:13, when it talks about that they brought the son to the father. Now, what
Yes.
point of time is that?
This is during the judgment, brother Tony. The
That's
judgment we have
right.
been.
So that's not in 1844, right?
No,
No, right. Okay.
I think it's at the end of the judgment when Jesus receives his kingdom.
When Jesus, right. When Jesus, because I've heard them say that that's when he moved from the holy to the most holy.
Right. I don't agree with that. And the reason I'm
Right,
going
right.
through all of this is to show you that even though I don't agree with many of the conclusions of Adventism, I'm going to show you that what they say is not as ridiculous as it sounds because there is biblical support for what they are saying. Where I'm going to find fault is because I think they interpret some things too literalistically. Okay, like they believe Jesus is standing before God. You know, Ellen White said that Jesus stood before God and said, Father, my blood, my blood, my blood. You know, equivalent. You always see pictures of Jesus standing as a priest in the priest's garment, and he's in the temple and he's kind of sprinkling something. These are the pictures that you find in Adventism all the time, and they give the impression that what happened on earth is just transferred to heaven, but it's in a bigger place and on a bigger scale, but it's the same kind of ministry. That is where I have a serious problem with the way they interpret things. Now I'm going to make my comments about Jesus going into the holy place and where did he go in 1844 and all the rest of that. But I'm going to come to that. Okay. So let me go back to my illustrations and focus on a few things here that I want to make clear. Now, Paul says in the same Hebrews chapter 9, we're still in Hebrews 9. Paul says, for there was a tabernacle made. I want to highlight a few words. There was a tabernacle made. How did my highlighter get so pale? There was a tabernacle made. The first, he's referring to the first apartment. When he says there was a tabernacle made, he says the first, referring to the first apartment, in which was the candlestick and the table, candlestick and the table table with the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. Now, I'm going to switch to another screen because there's something, to another illustration. There's something that is said here that there's a mistranslation, and I want to point it out. Now, first of all, he says he's looking at the sanctuary itself. Now, we're not looking at the part with the big altar where they sacrifice the animals, nor the laver. This is the sanctuary itself, the two apartment building, okay, where you had these the candlestick, the table, the little altar of incense, and the ark of the covenant. This is the sanctuary. These are the two apartments. Now, Paul says in the first there was a candlestick and so on and so forth, and he says this is called the sanctuary. I see what happened. I was using the highlighter. Give me a second. This thing keeps switching on me all the time, and I have no idea why. But anyway, we will defeat it. Right. He says the first apartment is called a sanctuary. That is not true. And after the second veil, that is this one, the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all. That is correct. He's talking about this apartment. It's called the holiest of all, or the most holy place. But he says the first one is called the sanctuary. And that's not true. This was not called the sanctuary. This was called the holy place. So is it Paul who made a mistake, or is it somebody else? It's not Paul who made the mistake. It's the translators who made the mistake. And I'm going to show you. So he says there was the first apartment. And the first apartment was really called the holy, or the holy place. It was not called the sanctuary. The King James translators made a mistake here. It was not called the sanctuary. It was called the holy place. And the second apartment, which is called the most holy, well, the King James translators translated it as the holiest of all, which is okay, because it means the same thing as the most holy. All right? Now, if that was the only mistake they made, it would have been fine, but they made a few more, which has messed up things. So the holy place, the first apartment, the most holy, the second apartment. Now I'm going to go into the verse in detail and show you all the mistakes they made in translation. Hebrews 9 verses 1 to 3. These are the verses. Let us see what is right and what is wrong. The first covenant had ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Correct. Correct. There was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was a candlestick, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. Not right. It was not called the sanctuary. It was called the holy place. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. Correct. I have no idea why the translators of the King James would call the first apartment the sanctuary. At least I have an idea, and I'm going to explain to you why they did it. All right? When you misunderstand something, you can really mess up. Anyway, let's continue. What I'm going to do now is the part where it can get a little tricky, and I want you to pay attention, please. And I'm going to encourage you, if I say something here and you don't follow me, please stop me, okay? Please stop me. I want you to understand. I'm trying to be as clear as I can, bringing all my teaching skills into practice, but I know how difficult it is sometimes. So if you don't understand, let me know. Now, the Greek word, we are looking at the Greek language now. We're going to go to the Greek. I hate to go to the Greek, but sometimes it is helpful. The word, let me go to the Bible. Let me go to the Bible and show you something first of all. Let's go back to our passage in Hebrews, and I'm going to show you something. And for those of us who like to quote the Greek, I want to show you something that sometimes you are not It doesn't help at all to go to the Greek unless you're a Greek scholar. I'm going to show you where. Let me bring up my Greek thing. All right. Now we are going to go to Hebrews 9. Please bear with me. All right, Hebrews 9. Now I want you to look at it. Hebrews 9, verses 1 to 3. We just looked at this and we saw where Paul referred to it as a sanctuary. Then he referred to it as the holiest place. Now look at what it says in the Greek. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Look at the word. G39. G39. And the word, if you look at in the bottom section, it is taken from the word hagion, the Greek word hagion. Notice it's the Greek in the Strong's Concordance. It is number G39. G39, hagion, which means a sacred thing or a sacred place. Verse 2. For there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called sanctuary. G39, same word. So G39 up here is translated as sanctuary. G39 here is translated as sanctuary. That's why the King James translators translated it at the first apartment is called sanctuary, because it's the same Greek word, hagion. Let's go on. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, and if you look at it, it's G39, G39, repeated. It's literally translated hagion, hagion. It's the word repeated twice and it means the most holy place. So if you just look at the Strong's Concordance, it says the first place is called the sanctuary, the second place is called the sanctuary, and the third place is called sanctuary, sanctuary. If you just look at it literally, the way it reads. And if you go to the Strong's Concordance, that's all you will find. That's why sometimes the Strong's Concordance is not the best thing when you're trying to look at problems like this. What you have to do is to go to what is called an interlinear translation. I know Destiny will understand because the Jehovah's Witnesses have their own interlinear translation. What you need is an interlinear translation. Why do we need an interlinear translation? Because the word hagion, it has different tenses and different it's not just tense, it's the form of the word. You know, like in English, we don't express things like they do in some languages. Like one word, say you have a word named we say something is good. Nuances, Destiny says. Yes, that is one of the phrases that would help. We say it is of the boy, it is to the boy, it is for the boy, but boy remains the same. In some languages, it is not like that. If it is of the boy, it would be boyo. If it is for the boy, it would be boyan. If it is from the boy, it would be boyu or something. The word itself changes if you are saying of or towards or from. Any of these positions with regards to the word, and the word changes, even though it's the same original word, boy. And it's the same thing with this word hagia, which means holy. It changes. And the Strong's Concordance won't show you the change at all. You're only going to see the same word, holy, 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 for all of those cases. You need an interlinear translation to see how the word changes. And that's what I'm going to put on the screen now. Now, when it says the first covenant had divine service and a worldly sanctuary, the word for sanctuary is the word hagion. And it means holy place, holy places. It's literally translated as holies. All right. Okay, let's move on a little bit. The second word that is used, which is referring to the holy place, the first apartment, is translated here as the sanctuary. As I said, it's a wrong translation. First apartment was not called the sanctuary. The Greek form of the word is hagia, hagia, and it means holy. All right. So the whole sanctuary is called holies. You would say holy places. That's what the word hagion means. The first apartment is called hagia, which means holy or a holy place. The third, the most holy place. Let me see. I can use green here probably. Let's see if I can find a convenient color. All right, I'll use green. Okay, let me use green. The third section of the sanctuary, or the second apartment, is called holiest of all. And the word that is used is not one word, two words, hagia, hagion, which means holy of holies. Holy of holies. If you look at the Greek word, you'll see it is agia, agion. That's the Greek up on top here, and it means holy of holies. So Paul tells us right at the beginning in Hebrews chapter 9, he tells us right at the beginning, if you are talking about the sanctuary, if you are talking about the sanctuary, the entire sanctuary, which word would you use? Now, let me see if somebody can type that quickly in the chat. I want to get a response from you. If you are talking about the entire sanctuary, which word would you use? Let me see if you are following me. Somebody type it very quickly. Thank you, Destiny and Brother Ian. You'd write holies, which is the word hagion. Hagion. If you're talking about the first apartment, the first room, which word would you use? Which word did Paul use? He used the word hagia, which means the holy. Correct. So you got it. Okay. If you're talking about the holiest place, you would not use one word, you would use two words. Hagia, hagion. Now, I hope it's not just a couple of us that are getting the point. I know it's complicated. I know. I empathize and I sympathize and I apologize. All right. But there's no way to bring this across and to help you to understand except going about it this way. And I think it's important, right? You're going to meet upon people who tell you that what you believe is nonsense because Jesus performed the Day of Atonement ritual way back in AD 31. And they'll take you to Hebrews 9 and say, Hebrews 9 teaches that Jesus went into the holiest place when he went back to heaven. Hebrews 9 does not teach that. It is mistranslation of the Greek words. Now, Paul is a Greek scholar, right? I'm not a Greek scholar. I'm a Jamaican. If I'm going to use some Jamaican terminology, okay? There's Brother Ian. There's Sister Rose. There's Brother Arthur and Sister Natalie. I can see them. Brother Matt, do you understand what I mean if I use the word talawa? Do you understand if I say bunununus? No. What about you, Sister Natalie? You understand those two words? Nod your head if you do. All right, great. I guarantee you that all the Jamaicans know what talawa and bunununus and nyam and bickle, I know what it means, right? Now, if I'm talking to you Americans or Australians or Europeans who don't understand Jamaican, what I will do is, if I'm going to talk about bunununus or talawa, before I start, I will tell you what the word means. I would say when I use the word talawa, it means you're small, but you're strong. That's what talawa means. I would say when I use the word bunununus, I mean you're cute and cuddly and nice to be around. So I tell you what the words mean. And from now on, anywhere I use the word talawa, you know what I'm talking about. And anywhere I use the word bunununus, you know what I'm talking about. I will not say bunununus if I mean talawa because I'm a Jamaican. I don't make those mistakes. I know what the words mean. I would never say talawa if I mean you're cute and you're cuddly. If you are small but you are strong, I will say talawa. Okay? So I define what I'm talking about. And so there's no confusion, there are no mistakes in our discussion. So Paul is doing the same thing right at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 9. He tells you, if I'm speaking about the entire sanctuary, I will use the word hagion. If I'm speaking about the first apartment, I will use the word hagia. And if I'm speaking about the most holy place, I will use the words hagia, hagion. He actually tells you, he actually uses the phrase is called. Is called. Because he wants you to know this is the terminology for these things. Now, because we are reading in English and we are reading in English where they have somewhat perverted the meaning, that's why we have a challenge. Because we are reading the English and they have used wrong translation. So sometimes we get confused. And that is why I had to take the tedious task this evening of going back to the Greek, because I want to show you it was written in Greek. And in the Greek, nobody who reads Greek would have a confusion. They would read Hagion and they say, okay, he's talking about the sanctuary. Hagia, okay, he's talking about the first apartment. Hagia, Hagion, okay, he's talking about the most holy place. So it becomes clear in your mind what Paul is talking about. You're not confused. Having said this, can somebody make a guess and tell me, how many times do you think Paul uses this phrase in the entire book of Hebrews? Let me show you the phrase I'm talking about. This phrase. How many times do you think Paul uses this in the entire book of Hebrews? Anybody want to venture a guess? Let me see if you can put it in the chat. How many times do you think Paul uses this word, this phrase, in the entire book of Hebrews? Somebody make a guess, or if you know. All right, thank you, Daniel. If you said, like Daniel, if you said once, you're absolutely correct. The only place in the book of Hebrews where Paul uses the word, the phrase Hagia Hagion, meaning the holiest of all, is right here when he says, after the second veil, you had the apartment that was called Hagia Hagion. This is the only place in the book of Hebrews. There's no place that Paul says Jesus went into the Hagia Hagion. He does not say that. Go to your Bible, go to the book of Hebrews, and every place where it says that Jesus went straight into the holiest of all, it's a mistranslation. The book of Hebrews does not say this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you. Let me go to see if I can go. Okay, here are the verses that speak about this word Hagia. And I say the word Hagia, but it's not Hagia. It's Hagia. It's Hagion. It's a different form of the word, but the root word is Hagia. That's why I have the word Hagia here, right? The word Hagia. That's the root word. That's the word you will find in, well, Hagion is the root, right? That's the word you'll find in the Strong's Concordance. But as I pointed out, it has different nuances as Sister Destiny gave me the word. Now, here are the places where you'll find Hagia or Hagion in the King James Version. Not in the King James Version, in the Greek text. You'll find it in Hebrews 8, verse 2, 9, verse 2, 13, 11. They're all here on the screen. And I'd just like to quickly look at each of those, and I'll show you how they have been translated or mistranslated. Okay? It says in Hebrews 8 and verse 2, he's a minister of the sanctuary. All right? If you guess that this word is Hagion, with an O-N at the end, you are correct. He's a minister of the Hagion, because Hagion means holies or holy places. I know you'll remember that. Hagion means holy or holy places. Jesus is a minister of the holy places or of the sanctuary, and which is the true tabernacle that the Lord pitched and not man. All right. Simple enough. But there was a tabernacle made, Hebrews 9, verse 2. We just went through this. I can skip over this. All right. which is called the sanctuary, you saw that it wasn't called the sanctuary, it was called the holy place, which is Hagia. It should not have been translated as sanctuary. The proper translation is the holy place, the word Hagia. Chapter Hebrews 13 and verse 11. The bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp. The word here again is the word, sorry guys, is the word, is not, is the word Hagia, Hagion. It's brought into the sanctuary, into the holy places by the high priest. The one I really want to get to, let me get there. Let me skip over some of these because some of these are not mistranslated. Here is the one that I wanted to look at, Hebrews 9 and verse 12. It's the one that I mentioned that people love to point to. Look at what it says. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place. King James Version is right, into the holy place. This is the verse that I was looking at before. And as we saw, the NIV, the Amplified Bible, and we saw another version, they have all translated this as the most holy place. Which word do we have here? Let me go to the Bible and we'll look and see which word we have. Sorry, let me clean this up. Hebrews 9 and verse 12. Let's go to Hebrews 9 and verse 12. And if you look, you will see that it's the same word Hagia. It doesn't give you the nuances that we are looking for. It doesn't give you the Hagia or Hagion. And that's why people make a mistake about it. Hebrews 9 and verse 12. That's why people misunderstand it. Hebrews 9 and verse 12. He entered in once into the holy place. And all it tells you is G39, same G39, Hagion. To really get the meaning of what this is, whether it should be Hagia or Hagion, we need to go to the interlinear translation. But one thing you know, it is not the most holy place. How can you even look at this and know that it's not the most holy place? Somebody drop me an answer in the chat and let's see if you're following me. Somebody tell me, how can you know that this is not referring to the most holy place? Somebody drop me a message in the chat if you're following me. Thank you, Brother Wayland. Praise the Lord. I have some people who are following me. Thank you, Brother Ian. It's only G39. If it was the most holy place, it would have G39 2 times. Because G39 is holy, holies, holy of holies. That's what it literally means. Holy of holies. Hagia, Hagion. You'd have G39 twice. So even in looking at the Strong's Concordance, you can see that it does not mean the most holy place. So the NIV which translates it as the most holy place is wrong. The Amplified Bible which translates it as the holy of holies of heaven is wrong. I'm sorry to see it because I like the Amplified Bible, but sometimes people can make the silliest mistakes because of preconceived ideas. The English Standard Version says he entered once for all into the holy places, which I believe is correct. This is what Paul means to say. He says Jesus went up into the holy places above. He's not talking about which apartment Jesus was in. Paul was not dealing with which apartment at all. It was of no concern to Paul because Paul is not speaking about the Day of Atonement. He's not looking at the Jewish feasts. In fact, Paul says in the same chapter, if I can go back to a comfortable view. This is nice when you're looking at the Greek, but it's a little awkward. If you go back to Hebrews chapter 9. Okay. Paul says that he says of which we cannot now speak particularly. What he's saying is that we don't have the time. This is not the place where we're going to discuss the sanctuary in detail. That's what he's saying. He mentioned Aaron's rod that budded, the cherubims of glory, and he says, of which we cannot now speak particularly. But what he says is that Jesus is a minister of this sanctuary. And what the priest was doing in the earthly sanctuary, Jesus is involved in the equivalent of this service up in heaven. But it does not say that Jesus went into the most holy place as we see. He entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. It does not say he went into the most holy place. There's another place where the King James Version messes it up as well. Let me see if I can find that other place and show you. Let me go down. The high priest enters the holy place every year with the blood of others. That is a correct translation. Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself now to appear in the presence of God for us. That is correct also. He's saying that Jesus did not go into the holy places of the earthly sanctuary. They are holy places, 2 apartments. But he's entered into heaven, into the heavenly holy places to minister for us. He's not talking about which apartment. He's talking about which sanctuary. Maybe that's the best point I can make. The whole point Paul is making is Christ did not enter the earthly sanctuary, the earthly holy places. Christ has entered the heavenly sanctuary or the heavenly holy places. That's where Christ went at his ascension. He went straight to the heavenly holy places. The mistake that people make is saying that Jesus went straight into the most holy. They are adding something to what Paul was saying. Paul was not concerned about which apartment. The only time we concern ourselves about which apartment is when we start talking about the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement is at the end of time. And Paul was not dealing with this. He says we cannot now look at the services of the sanctuary particularly. We're not looking at that now. So he wasn't dealing with that at all. Where is that? Here is the other place where the King James Version mistranslates. Hebrews 10 and verse 19. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus. I have no idea why the King James Version messed up here. Because if you look at remember I said that there's one version that translates it properly. And I said it was the NASB. The NASB translated correct every time. So let's look at Hebrews 10 and verse 19 in the NASB. And let us see what translation we get from the NASB. Hebrews 10 and verse 19. Let's go back to the Bible. All right, chapter 10, verse 19. The King James Version says, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest. Of course, if you are reading this, you're going to come to the conclusion Paul is teaching that Jesus went into the most holy place. But the Greek text, the literal Greek text, if you go over to the NASB, it says, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place. That's what the Greek says. It's Hagia. It's not Hagia, Hagion. Now, just to give you an idea of how to emphasize how we need to be careful, I bet you the NIV said the most holy place. NIV, the most holy place. World English Bible, the holy place. The World English Bible tries to be faithful to the text. Okay. New English Translation, the sanctuary. All right, that's better. It's talking about the holy places. Amplified Bible, the Holy of Holies. You got it wrong again, Amplified Bible. English Standard Version, holy places. I think this is correct. So, if you look at the difference between the holiest, that would be Hagia, Hagion, and the holy places, which would be Hagion, it's a big difference. The Greek word is different. Somebody is messing with the translation. And it turns out that in this case, it was the King James translators. And we have to sympathize with them a little bit because they are reading the Bible and they are trying to make sense of what they are reading. They don't understand anything about the Day of Atonement. They don't understand these issues. And they are trying to make sense of what they are translating. And so they put in something that they think should be there, even though the text does not say so. That's a bad thing to do, but you find that translators do this because one of the things they are trying to do, they're trying to make sense of what they are translating. But from my perspective, I prefer the NASB, where they just translate what is there and leave me, the reader, to decide what did God mean here. Because if God puts the word there, he knows what he means. And you don't want anybody messing and perverting what should be there. So I don't know if I made a mess of trying to explain this evening, or I managed to explain it in a way that it made sense. Now there is more to this than I went through. There's something else that adds a little bit to what I'm saying, but I don't think I'm going to go into it this evening because it's already a very complicated study. It's already very complicated, and I know that too much can lead to congestion of your mind, and you just zone out. I know how it is. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask a question. Please, what don't you understand and what do I need to explain better? Anybody or everybody? Brother
Question
Joel.
for me. Yeah, you made it so simple in my mind, at least, what you're saying, and I could understand and follow you, David. Why is it that the church, the Adventist church, had such a hard time pushing back against Ford in Glacier View on this topic?
Well, I would suggest that the reason is because even when you get through this hurdle, as I've explained it here, the other hurdle is to explain the investigative judgment so that it makes sense. Because you know the Adventist interpretation of the investigative judgment does not make sense.
Agreed.
It gives you a legalistic perspective. The challenge that they have is to explain, is to tie the idea of the investigative judgment to make it fit with the idea that Jesus is my righteousness and my salvation cannot be in jeopardy. The two things are not harmonizing. And so when you come to defend your position with that kind of background, you're on the back foot from the beginning. I think that was one of the reasons.
That makes sense to me. But the problem for me why I was having a hard time is, as you say, just looking at the Strongs, because the Strongs do not show, like you did with the linear, the difference in the Greek word there. As it, I thought you did a really excellent job, David, explaining it, and it makes so much more sense to me now, because it's something I was really struggling with. So thank you very much.
Okay, Brother Joel, I'm grateful that at least, one person, it was very helpful and you understood. Sister Di, go ahead.
Yes, Brother Joel, point. At Glacier View, the problem was not only the confusion, but a lot of those, there was 1,000 pastors in that Glacier View against Ford. And the majority of them really agreed with Ford. They had a hard time with the investigative judgment. They had to stick with it because of pride and because of the church's view, even though it's not taught at Andrews. But they had an evangelical view, but they could not say it. So they're pushing and arguing with him with arguments that were just, in his mind, he figured he won the debate, because what he said afterwards, I remember reading what he wrote to Brimsmead, was that they did agree, and eventually it would show that they were in agreement with him. So that was the problem that most people didn't understand looking at Glacier View over that issue. That was the problem. The church people didn't know. And then after Ford, after that thing happened, most of them left. That was the thing. Most of them left after that. And of course, then he told them not to leave, and all of them that left went to Sunday keeping. And he told them not to leave because they could do more good if they stayed, which means they could change more minds if they stayed. So those who stayed did just that. And those who left went to Sunday keeping.
Thanks, Sister Diane. That additional information, yes, very helpful. And it's good, Sister Destiny. I really appreciate that you have your camera on, because it makes me acutely aware that what we are saying is going over your head. So this is Adventist history that we're discussing a little bit here, and I just want to explain because I don't want to leave anybody behind. So Adventists had a big get together by some of their top theologians. There was a man named Desmond Ford who was a big theologian in Adventism, and he rejected the end time day of atonement. He rejected the investigative judgment. He rejected the idea that Jesus began something in 1844, and he was one of the persons who pushed the idea that Jesus went straight into the most holy place. So they had a big conference that was called at a place called Glacier View, with, as Sister Diane said, over 1,000 ministers, and they discussed this back and forth. And of course, they would not agree with Desmond Ford because these were people that were paid by the church. But as was pointed out, many of them secretly agreed with him, and so they couldn't come to any conclusion as to, one of the things I find out is that if you want truth, don't depend on church councils. Go to the Bible and be independent, because there are too many political agendas and expediency issues that are driving these people who are big theologians, so-called big theologians. So they never got very far, and that's what Brother Joel was asking about. Yes, Sister Di.
When Elder Bradford was asked about it, he said it wasn't time. So he knew. He said the church isn't ready. It wasn't time. So when you know people like that and you know the background of things that are going on, you can see the deception that the people are under by listening to leaders, trusting them with your belief system when they're tricking you and deceiving you. He knew that the majority of them, and when he was questioned about it, he said it wasn't time. Church wasn't ready.
Mm-hmm. And my position, studying it on my own, I've come to the conclusion that both are wrong. Desmond Ford was wrong, and the church is wrong. So I say this to reinforce the idea that let's not take sides. Let's study the Bible and let's take the Bible's side, because many times, they have a saying. I'm not sure if it's a Jamaican saying. Well, it's a Jamaican saying, but you may have the equivalent in other places. Jamaicans say, if it don't go so, it nearly goes so. And what they mean is, if you hear a rumor or somebody comes with something and you hear it a few times, even if it's not true, there's truth in it. Okay? Because it comes from the idea that things are not based upon nothing. There's always a basis for something that people say, even if it's not perfectly accurate. And it's true. You look at the Adventist position, and it has a basis in Scripture. Okay, they have a basis in Scripture, and they took the Scripture and they got something good, and they messed it up by putting it in a legalistic framework. They don't understand the point of the book of Revelation. They don't understand what's going on in Daniel 7 because of the legalistic framework. They miss the point. And the other people who just wholesale reject everything, they miss the opportunity to get something deeper and more beautiful out of the Bible. So it's in my, and somebody may say, how do you know that you are not wrong as well? And that's a legitimate question. But the point is that I'm not claiming, none of us here is claiming to be infallible. But what we claim is that as we study the Bible and we look at these issues and we try to be faithful to the Bible, things become more and more clear and they make more and more sense. That's the best that we can do.
I think,
Yes, Brother Joel.
I think, David, the way in which you went about it by looking at how he starts in Hebrew 9, kind of giving a layout of the sanctuary and the apartments, then going down into 12 and 13. Why it makes so much sense to me, what you're saying, is because God in his wisdom, I think, allowed Paul to speak about the temple, the sanctuary, in terms of it being the sanctuary, the holy, and the most holy. in a description of it that we can see that he is taking the time to explain what is happening in both sections within the sanctuary. So by the time you get to down to 12:13, where you have the Haggy on there, it's hard to not appreciate the point that you're making, David. Now, where I have a question in my mind still is, why would you find it objectionable, an understanding that Christ went into the holy to sit next to his Father, on the right hand of his Father, with the understanding that when he comes forth out of it, it's just like you would have the high priest coming out of the temple at the end of the Day of Atonement. Why do you find it necessary to see him being in the holy when he arrived? What would be your objection to him being in the most holy?
The honest truth is, I wouldn't object, but I wouldn't insist on it either, because to me, it is a bit irrelevant. And I'll explain why. Because the more I understand the principle of type and antitype, the more I understand that what we should look for is the meaning of the activity instead of the activity itself. In other words, you know, in the type, you had a priest moving from apartment to apartment. But I believe that what is important is not which apartment he is in. I think that's irrelevant. What I think is important is, what does the apartment represent in terms of the work of Jesus? Maybe in heaven, they move to different apartments. Maybe they do. But I mean, it's irrelevant in terms of understanding the work of Christ, because Jesus could do his work in this apartment as well as that apartment. None of us is there to know. It doesn't matter. So the most important thing for me is, what does the work represent? Okay,
I
not
think
which
you answered
apartment
well.
is he in.
I think you answered well. That's a very good answer, because I agree with you. Whether or not he's in the first or the second apartment, in terms of whatever he's doing with his blood, not with the blood of sheep and goat, but with his own blood, making propitiation for us, is the real important thing, not which apartment he's doing it in. So thank you, David. Appreciate that.
You're welcome, my brother. But Ian, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you said, that my strong shows me that whenever it says double, it means holy of holies.
Okay.
But I have a question. How do you? I wanted to comment on verse 7 and 8 of chapter 9.
I know you're going to carry me into that more complicated part that I said there was still something else to be said, but I didn't want to touch on it because I didn't want to put too much of a strain on people's mind this evening. I think that's where you're going to carry me. Yes, that's where you're carrying me, 7 and 8. So if you will hold it till next week, and I'm going to say this.
Okay.
Because it takes a little explaining, and I don't want to overburden people's minds this evening, but I will deal with it next week if you remind me. All right?
All right.
Because I know that can complicate it, because that seems to suggest something else. But
I just read it and it just came to me, so that's why I'm asking the question. I didn't know that that's what you were trying to avoid. Okay, no problem. I'll wait.
All right. No problem then. So, Brother Mark, go ahead.
So to be clear, there's no way to be sure, but there probably isn't a sanctuary in heaven, from my understanding. And I'm thinking that's your position as well. There's no literal sanctuary. There's no, when Moses was given the plan to build the earthly sanctuary, and it was a type of what was to be in heaven. It wasn't. I don't agree that it was something that he saw in heaven and God gave him the plans from the heavenly to the earthly. It was a type of ministry that Jesus carried out. It was a plan. It was a type. And I don't think that the spiritual application that Paul is talking about, he's only using Old Testament language, but he's only doing that to help people to understand, to refer to what's really going on. The heavenly sanctuary is not, it's spiritual. It's not physical.
Okay, let me answer you as best as I can, brother Matt. I'm not going to say there's no sanctuary in heaven, and I'm not going to insist that there's a sanctuary, but I'm going to tell you the reasons why. back in 1988, 87, I began to teach that there's no literal sanctuary in heaven. I began to believe it. I don't remember if I was teaching it, but the reason was because, for the same reason that you put forward, I thought, you know, God doesn't need to live in a house. I mean, there's no need for buildings or anything like that. And then one day I was meditating and thinking about it, and I was thinking, okay, God doesn't need to live in a house. Where does God live? What does heaven look like? And I was thinking about it, and I think, if there are no buildings and there are no places in heaven, what does heaven look like? It looks like nothing. I remember when I was a little boy, when you talked about heaven and angels, I thought about clouds. I thought about just a cloudy place. All I could see was clouds as a little boy. I had no idea or no picture or no image of heaven. And I began to think, well, are there places in heaven? And if there are places, what kind of places? I'm sure I don't know. But I'm thinking that there has to be places. Otherwise, when we go to heaven, we will see nothing. So what are we going to see? The Bible gives us descriptions of places and so on, you know, but some of it we believe are figurative. But does it mean that there's nothing and there's no place? What I understand the sanctuary to be is that the sanctuary is God's dwelling place. So wherever God lives, that is the sanctuary. But where God lives, is it enclosed, or is it just a wide open space in the universe where God sits down on a sea of glass and nothing? There are no divisions, nothing, no separations, and I can't envision it. So it made me think, you know, Jesus said we should be careful that we don't offend the children. Why? Because he says, because their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. Furthermore, look at what Jesus says. He says, whoever shall swear by the throne of God swears by the throne and by the one that sits on it. So there's a throne. Where is the throne? Is it sitting on clouds, or is it in a place? And does God need a throne to sit down? Well, I'm sure everybody agrees God doesn't need a throne to sit down, but most of us believe that he's sitting on a throne. And if he's sitting on a throne, if it's a piece of furniture, why shouldn't there be a room? So these are kind of like reasoning arguments that I don't know if any of us has a perfect answer. But because of this, I'm not going to say there's no sanctuary, and I'm not going to say there is a sanctuary. But I know that the sanctuary is used to represent primarily the work that is happening there. It's not that God is saying, look at the geography of heaven, because if he were, he would give us a detailed description that we would have a picture in our mind exactly what we are going to see. And Paul says our mind has not even imagined the things that we will see, that will be prepared for us. So
I can accept that. And I can accept the things that you say. And I never said that there was nothing in heaven. I'm sure there's a place where God dwells. It's probably more beautiful than the place that's outside of it, possibly, but I don't know. But I could definitely accept that. And the only reason I said these things was to say that some cultures, some like Adventism, puts a lot of emphasis on this image and this work of Christ, as far as what the Old Testament speaks about, and the way it's depicted there. I don't necessarily it goes that way. Yeah.
I agree. Some people have made it so literal, you know, the legalistic mindset. They have made it so literal that it's just a blown up image of what is on earth. And absolutely, that is the other extreme that is objectionable. All right. Well,
Thank you.
You're welcome, my brother. I think we probably can dismiss for this evening then. Sister Destiny.
Brother David.
Yes, Sister Elizabeth. Let me just take Sister Destiny and then you can go.
She can go because it's mine. Mine is a little bit on topic from the beginning of the conversation, so she can go.
All right. Go ahead, Sister Elizabeth.
Okay, so the verse that says, well, you quoted a verse early that said, that said, eyes have not seen nor ears heard what the Father has in store for you.
Mm-hmm.
But he reveals them to his saints, he said. So with that said, along with this verse, in my Father's house are many mansions, which are rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you so. I go to prepare a place for you. A place, we may not know what it looks like, but I in my brain cannot fathom going to a blank place, because the 144,000 are going to be in the city and never come out of the city. So we know the difference between city and country, because one has walls, one doesn't. So I'm trying to put all this together.
Sure. I agree with you, and that is the reason why I'm not going to say there's no place. I mean, I know, and I didn't understand Brother Matt to be saying that either. But I think when you reason about it and you ask yourself some questions, we have to conclude that heaven is a real place, even though it's a place where spirits dwell. But one of the mistakes that people sometimes make is they don't realize that spirits have bodies, and spirits they live in another dimension. But it doesn't mean they are not material in a sense. Maybe material is the opposite of spirit. That's not the right word to use. But they are tangible beings in in their own dimension, and we'll be spirit, but it doesn't mean we're going to be cloud and dust. So I agree with you there. Sister Destiny, you can go ahead.
Okay, at the beginning of the meeting, you had mentioned that there are ones who have left religions and then gone to the extreme and they've completely disowned what they were taught. So my question is that since God knew who would be his, when people leave false religion and they completely abandon their beliefs, is it that some people, and this is probably more of your opinion, I guess, than biblically based, but is it possible that some people's worship is truly in vain? Because I'm thinking about in my situation, in that you're in false religion and then you leave, and as opposed to completely abandoning your faith, you find Christ. And it makes me think of, I think it's First Corinthians 3:12, where it talks about, if your foundation is built on stones or straw. So is it possible that some people sincerely will not be able to find Christ regardless of their efforts? Does that make sense to you?
I think I kind of understand, and maybe not completely, but let me answer, and then you see if I've touched on the point you're making. I have a very strong conviction that there's nobody who sincerely seeks Christ who will ever be left in the dark. I have a conviction that God is seeking so hard to save people that anywhere he can find a sincere heart and an open mind, he will reach that person. Sometimes the journey is long, sometimes it takes a lot of reconfiguration, but he will do it because he wants to save everybody who can be saved. So I think there are people who are religious, and they may come to recognize that there's a problem with their religion and they move to another religious position. But I don't think that they are sincerely seeking for the Lord with a humble spirit, because if they do, they will find him. I know people move from one place to another place and they are in just as much darkness as before. I don't know if this is what you're looking at, and if this is so, yes, I believe there are people like that. But I believe that the most I beg your pardon, the most ignorant person, the most the simplest person who sincerely is seeking for the Lord, he will find. That's what I believe. You know,
That answers the question. Thank you.
all right, you're welcome. The bottom line is, it's what we've been talking about so much and talking about even today, which is that, oh my goodness, if it were up to us to find God, I think we would all be lost. I read a poem once called The Hound of Heaven. The Hound of Heaven. And at first, looking at the title and seeing how it started out, I was a little bit disturbed because it seemed to be disrespectful of God. But what it was talking about is how, you know, when a hound gets his nose to the trail, he does not leave the trail until he finds what he's looking for. And the poem actually compares God or Jesus to a hound, in the sense that once God gets on your trail, he does not leave you alone. He does not let up. He pursues you through the mud and the slime and the bog and the hard places and the high and the low until one day he finds you. And you have been running and tearing yourself up to pieces and seeking for answers and pleasures in every place. But as long as there is some little hope in you, he's not leaving you alone.
Amen.
Amen. And that is that. This is a certainty that makes me know that no sincere person will ever fail of finding the Lord, because the Lord was looking for you long before you were looking for him.
That's beautiful.
And it's true. All right. So we're going to close off at that point, brothers and sisters. I don't know if I can persuade somebody to do the closing prayer. Can I?